All right, guys, welcome to another Consult ROI podcast. I've got Danny here
Hey.
as usual, and we are going to get right into it. This is just a pretty brief, simple thing about effective communication. It's really what it comes down to. So this is one of those things that we've touched on before, because a very big key part of communication in any environment is the fact of how well you have the respect and how it has to do a lot with the culture that you've established in this. But there's still always, no matter how great of a culture and everything, you still will have roadblocks that you will come across, and that when it comes to communication, just because we're all different people. It's the same thing even with siblings that we grew up or spent 18 years with, or a spouse that we have spent 20 plus years or whatever with. We still fight, we still have miscommunication issues, there's still stuff. So it's very common sense that you are going to have these problems, especially in a co-working environment. You have different values, you have different backgrounds, you have different things that are all coming together. And so the most effective way to do communication, at least in my opinion, is a couple different things. One is to build things and tools and resources that touch on multiple different learning styles all in the same thing. So, for example, if you want if you want to talk about policies or like a procedure or something that you're doing new, then what you do is you have a poster or visual representation, like, or a video or something like that, showing them how to do that. And then you have a hands-on that allows them to do that or step in and do it. And then another part which then capitalizes on all key principles of hands-on visual and everything else. And that does allow both to, regardless of what their learning style is, to be able to find that common ground and then be able to move forward from there. So what is something that you found from your experience that has really helped contribute to your teams? As you know, like, the bigger the company, the more this is prevalent, and you get a lot more of that other stuff and even agitation. I think part of the culture where the culture comes into play is when you have lazy employees that don't bother reading the entire email, or you have other employees too that like to write a biography for email instead of summarizing it, which it also contributes to why they don't read. So
Yeah.
there is that balancing act. But what would you say is the most effective way to communicate and the easiest way to set up a very clear standard of communication within a company?
Yeah, there's I mean several elements to that. And I mean it's kind of interesting because it's like you look at like resumes or job descriptions, and always on there is effective communication, written and oral, right? Like it says that every time, but that doesn't mean that those that they hire are skilled at that, because to your point, you've got a culture and you've got to kind of set that tone or standard there. Yeah, I've seen it all and I've experienced it all. I've been effective, I've been less effective. And so it's interesting, just in communicating overall. What I feel would be like common knowledge in communicating. I've experienced it where people are just completely oblivious to the world around them, both in their bodily, verbal, written, and whatever else I'm trying to get out there. But you know what I mean? Like they're just
Body
there's
language.
thank you. Yeah, body language, jeez. They're just completely oblivious to that world around them of how they're communicating, or what I might feel like, oh, someone just kind of like bust drove in, kind of elbowed their way in, and they might see it as, hey, I'm just being assertive. And so it's kind of takes a little bit of everybody's part there to do that. But I totally agree with you of setting up
Well, and it's very
tools, training,
hard,
and
especially
resources.
to, like you said and everything. That's a very good key point to capitalize on. Is it's very easy for when somebody is being assertive, or it's like, hey, I need you to get this. Well, you're getting bossy. I'm like, well, yeah,
Right.
you need to get this done. Like, this is the role in that. And especially if there's not established um this is where I don't necessarily believe in traditional business setups. I kind of like more a camaraderie or team where everybody holds each other accountable. There's not necessarily one above the other.
Like some
There,
hierarchy, closed
yeah,
door, don't jump the gun, don't skip ranks type thing.
yeah. Well, they're all essentially the same rank, but the other caveat is there because there does need to be like a patriarchy or role, right? So everybody has a role within the team. Like for example, on a military team, you have your medic, you have your specialist, you have your weapons or IED specialist or whoever, right? And then you have your breacher, you have your forward, you have your IQB, and other positions that essentially allow you to do that everybody knows what their task is. They know how to do each other's tasks as well to a certain degree, but their kit and everything, they're full. What they've gone to it is like, hey, I know that if these obstacles come up, these are the ones that are going to fall into under my purview, right?
Yep.
So it's the same thing. I think that is paramount to having your own corporate structure, which is with this, what can you do to establish like, hey, here's the roles. Everybody knows their responsibilities. How can we support each other in those roles? And I know that like, hey, I need you to help me get this done, right?
Yeah, exactly. And if they do have that mindset and everything, like it's going to get done, and they're going to feel supported and championed. I think a major gap that a lot of organizations have is establishing a mindset or is embracing that into the culture, to where it's hey, these are the goals and that's what we're working on. It's like, oh, it's not mine. That's totally out of scope of me, and that's okay to be out of scope, but communicate effectively that, hey, this is actually out of my scope or out of my skill set or out of my whatever. Can you help me, or can you point me in the right direction there? I think there's a professional way of going about that, instead of saying it's not mine, and then you just kind of feel like you're leaving your team hanging there. So effectively communicating, even when it's not your bag. In fact, today I was dealing with something where someone had reached out like, hey, I asked somebody to reach out to a customer about something, and it's been several weeks. And and it turns out what they were asking is actually not even a part of the organization they are reaching out to. Rather than being like, hey, you gave it to the wrong people, take it somewhere else. What I did was I took the extra steps of, okay, this is, even though it came to our area, it doesn't have to do with our company, but here are the steps that you can follow to get it to the right company that it needs to go to. And so just kind of like taking that burden off the person of who's already waited a couple of weeks for someone to reach out to this customer. Even though it wasn't ours, I tried to go a little bit above and beyond, saying, hey, sorry, it's not ours. You put it into ours and it didn't come to us, so that's why nobody reached out. But at the same time, here's where you go for them to get the right help that you're looking for, or at least pointed in the right direction there. And just communicating. And guess what? Instead of him freaking out saying, hey, I waited 2 weeks for this and you guys didn't even tell me this till now, he's like, hey, thanks so much, man. I didn't realize that. Thanks for the additional direction.
Yeah. Well, and that is key in a lot of regards. And the other thing too that I wanted to touch on is even in military type situations, right? Everyone wants to. I know I use that example a lot, but anybody who's ever been in or anything, frankly, knows that it is very disorganized a lot of the time, and you will have people that will essentially deal with um, sorry, I'm having kids destroy things in the background, so
Hey, it's real life right there. It's making
know,
it
right?
happen.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to keep distracted there or focused. But either way, in military though, the point what I was making is that it does not it you will find a lot of people that you're supposed to go through this training and you're supposed to be broken down and built back up as a team, right? But you will still have people that frankly will get all the way clear to deployment even, and like anybody can tell you that you cannot trust them. Like they're there for the paycheck, they're there for their own selfish gain, or anything else, but they're not somebody you can rely on. If shit ever goes down, you know that they're the first ones that are running, and you wouldn't trust them with a piece of candy, let alone your back. So that is an issue there, to where it is. It's not something that is just that somebody else is immune to, right? It's not something that you can just avoid regardless, and it's not something that no, even through intense training or all these other things that you can just magically remove out of the equation, right? There's still going to be disagreements. There's still going to be trust. There's still going to be other issues.
Sure.
But the nice thing is that instead of having all these politics involved on who gets recruited or who's allowed or what teams and everything else happens, and then you have these imbeciles that get promoted and all that other shenanigans. But you, as the business owner and also the employee, get to choose A, where you get to go, and B, and everything that who you're going to hire. And that, so if you're the employer, obviously you get to choose who you get to hire, who you get to keep on, and everything else. And you have full control on the cancers or the very toxic, selfish people you can remove. The only thing that I would say is advantageous in like a military or other stuff is the same reason, like we talked about earlier, where people don't take like marriage vows seriously or other commitments seriously, is like if you disobey in military, right, there's a very clear consequence. You can get court-martialed, you can get fined, you can get thrown in prison, whatever, right? So you're very highly incentivized to obey and get along with who you're like forced to at least make it work, right?
Yeah.
And that's more of a toxic relationship, whereas in a marriage of that, it's more like, hey, what can I do to show up as a partner so they can show up as the partner that I need in a marriage type deal. And it's the same thing in a company. I would say it's more closer to the marriage, which is like, hey, how can I enable them to show up how they should? And if they don't consistently show up, then what can I do to just let them move on to their journey? So funny enough, this actually just happened last week, where I ran into a former employee, and this employee, frankly, had stolen quite a bit of money from my company. And not only that, but I had gone above and beyond. It was still that process where I was still learning how to enable. And they did have a injury that made it difficult, and so I kept on using that as an excuse to be like, okay, this is why they have very subpar performance. So I'm going to be accommodating. So I went above and beyond to help pay for their stuff. I also help pay for training, help pay for rehabilitation, and then on top of that, I made sure that they were able to go get a bunch of like Christmas gifts for their family and that to
awesome.
Try to make that. And long story short, they still did not. They pretty much took all that money and all that stuff in that, and then just bounced essentially without getting into the nitty gritty on that. But it just had gotten to that point where I had to have a conversation and be like, hey, either you're going to stop making excuses and show up and appreciate the effort that I'm putting in to you, or we need to like part ways and I need to stop the bleeding at this point.
Yeah.
And that was the conversation it got to, which is my direct communication saying like, hey, I can't keep doing this.
Yeah.
Like,
not
so are you
sustainable.
going to step up? Are you going to do your part and everything? I've done everything I can to enable you or set you up for success. Are you going to step in? And it was a no. So that's when I was like, okay, great. Like, done.
Yep. Parting ways.
So when I saw them, and everything, and it was this business meeting, and we're presenting. It became a very, because there was still that like little, almost that awkward in that, because it didn't. While I was like, I started realizing that I still had a little bit of resentment just for how much money that person had taken. But I had to literally have that conversation with me before I presented in front of everybody, and that to be like, okay, I already know this is going to turn like awkward in that or whatever, but this is what's within my control.
Yeah.
This is what I can do and everything else. And I intentionally pushed myself to be to where I allowed them the opportunity to discuss well, they were talking to somebody else, and so I actually just took a second, step back, listened to them, talk to the company that they were currently working with other people, and realized, okay, this is like what it is like they're obviously in a lot better position now than they were with me. And it kind of went back to even our previous conversations where you realize that when you fire somebody, it's very easy to take that personal, right? It's very
Yeah,
easy to
absolutely.
do that. But it's not. And in fact, firing them quick, and that helps them move on with their life faster as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like there's a sales coach out there, guru named Mike Weinberg. He always says, "Coach them up or coach them out," right? And so by the time that it's time for someone to go, it should be no surprise to anybody that it's time for them to go, if that's been effectively communicated throughout the entire process, right? I've given you tools, training,
Something
and
that they can't
resources. We've had
eventually be.
conversations.
Yeah, especially if they, and granted, like if you can't be an effective leader, and that this is part of the communication. If you can't be an effective leader and communicate very clearly, hey, this is our standard, this is what we expect, and everything else, and then this is how we do it, right?
Yep,
I think
exactly.
a lot of companies are usually missing one or the other. Because how many,
Yeah,
like especially when you talk about beginner jobs and that, they just kind of throw you in and just say, okay, best of luck.
yeah.
Are you
Oh,
kidding me?
yeah, and I've been in non-beginner jobs, and they've basically done that same thing. I've done a horrible job of effectively communicating to me what exactly my expectations or their expectations of me were
Even
in
the
these roles as
escalation
well.
procedures, right?
Yeah,
Like
absolutely.
even basic things and that. It's like, hey, I get it. You should know your job, or at least some basics and everything. Even in technology, um, and that's the other thing too, is when you hire, like it needs to be communicated. Like the communication starts literally day one, even with the interview,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
And then being able to get and come to a compromise, because obviously the I equivalent like companies and employee relations, and that is almost the same as a marriage. And this is the reason why, is because there's so many similarities when it comes to personnel, integrating lives, or establishing or building up something or anything else. But when you get into these situations, and of course, I just had a freaking brain fart, and that tells you how tired I am. Um,
But I mean, it is effectively communicating. I think you're talking about just like building things up together, and the other part is like my wife knows I can't read her mind. Speaking of marriages and things, and same thing for your leaders. In fact, I was talking to a friend yesterday who's very frustrated with where he's at right now, job wise, running a warehouse and things, because everybody gets everything done and has all the time they need in his mind until the trucks need to be loaded, which he's in charge of. And this has to be out yesterday. And he's putting in 15-hour days on Saturdays and on the weekends and stuff like that. He's like, this is nothing that I signed up for. And in addition to that, like what's kind of going through my mind is like, how effectively are you communicating back to, this is not sustainable. You have asked me to do things that there's not enough hours in the day to do it. Oh, and then I can't pay my people overtime, he says. This is impossible. And so there's that. So there's his opportunity to communicate to the leaders, and then the leaders' opportunity to communicate up the chain to defend their team at the same time. When you kind of talk about that team and that camaraderie, you've got to have leaders that defend their team saying, hey, this is not sustainable of this ask. What can we do to work together further up the stream or up the chain to make sure that, everything can flow cohesively? And otherwise, you're going to have a breakdown at some point that could be catastrophic for a customer relationship, orders going out, those types of things. And it can escalate really, really fast, or it can run
Absolutely.
really, really smooth, like those of us that shop on Amazon. In our minds, for the most part, not always, but most part, I order it. Sometimes I can get the freaking things the same day, which is remarkable. But then, that just doesn't happen, right? Like, it can't just all of a sudden happen in same day service. They've had to like build up and effectively communicate, put operations in place and things like that.
I put systems in that isn't reliant on humans, because humans are prone to error, especially when you're dealing with that kind of quantity.
That's right. Yeah. So how do you automate some of these things? But then all that sends back to
how do you communicate effectively to the drivers and the other people to like make sure that the products are picked correctly, to double check the order, do all that other stuff.
Exactly.
I mean, before, especially if you look at Amazon, how many times did you used to get something ridiculously small, like earbuds or something like that, or plugs, and it was in a giant box, like a refrigerator box?
Yeah.
You're like, that one little stupid thing,
Exactly.
because that wasn't communicated very well. But the point I was trying to make earlier is, so when you are communication in the beginning of a relationship or dating and interview, like the first initial interview stages, is basically the same. You're basically putting your best foot forward. You're basically filling full of fluff. You're shooting rainbows and acting like you're a lot taller than you are, bigger than you are, whatever, right? Just to at least get that first introduction and so forth. But as we both know, typically, in most relationships that we're going to come across, in that business or otherwise, that's the best it's ever going to get. Unless you can establish better communication and foundation of trust up front, and then maintain that moving forward to make sure that it stays consistently there, and that, which is where the accountability, the trust, and then following through on whatever you say, like being your word in every aspect of that, because that does, like, you might not see it, but it does allow for effective communication. You don't have that premise, or that, at least that starting foundation baseline, then you do not have the ability to move forward from there. You don't have the ability to at least have them, because what will happen is they'll just shut down and they'll fire in their micro groups, and then they'll bash on you behind their back or whatever, and you've lost all communication. It's not, and the same thing I've mentioned in previous episodes too, is in any relationship, business or otherwise, it's not when they're communicating with you or being confrontational with you that you need to worry. It's when they go silent. And that to you, and then they'll talk other ways, right? They'll talk to everyone else but you. That's when it becomes a really big problem. So when they become confrontational or bring something up, make sure that you are valuing that at all points, right? Because if you don't value it at that point, that's where you're going to lose that communication that you're trying to build. And then you'll be like, I don't get, why wouldn't you tell me that things are deteriorating this bad? Why won't you do?
And it's like, when did they actually try to do that? And most of the time, right? They probably tried to mention something up the chain and they got shut down earlier on, and it was offensive to them and things there. I mean, I've experienced that as well, where starting in a new organization and it's like, hey, I've got all this, and this. This legit. I had the experience where I'm like, hey, I have connections in my network that could actually flow really well with what you guys are doing. And the, bless his heart, person that I reported to, that's not your job. Go back to doing what you are supposed to do. And at the same time, he didn't teach me what I was supposed to do, yet he shut me down on what wasn't my job, even though I had this fresh outside perspective. And so that thing never came to fruition. And so I experienced exactly that.
Well, and I think that again shows how shitty people are communicating, because what would have been like, there's 12 other things that you could have done better, right?
Sure.
He could have been like, hey, I just need you to do it this way first, and learn the process, and then we could reevaluate it or look at that and it's come into play first.
That makes
And
sense.
and then with yours, it's like, hey, this is what enable. I really need or would appreciate your perspective on this, on how you would like to see this done. And then I can always give that once I understand why you do the things that the way you do, right?
Yep.
But because there was not that foundation, he
Sure.
already had ego evolved, and ego
100%.
is the killer of communication in general. As soon
Yep.
as ego gets into the mix, you've pretty much killed any chance for a productive conversation, and that's the truth of that.
You're exactly right. And there's memes all over the place that say the biggest concern for any organization should be when their most passionate people become quiet. And so, I mean, just exactly what you said a moment ago there. So now there's so many different ways to effectively communicate and stuff. I mean, some things that we didn't even touch on is like, who's teaching our kids how to text, how to communicate with their friends when they do or don't want to hang out with each other, how to verbally communicate that so that their friends aren't offended when they're just doing something else. That's something that we're challenged with on a daily basis in our house. And so from a very young age, having these devices and figuring out how to communicate with others, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. And I think these are all little foundational aspects that are going to bleed into, going through school and everything. And, we've seen it where now it's like schools are trying to have to figure out how to teach these students how to communicate when they should have learned that in the home. And then it goes from the schools into now these are, young adults working in the workplace who probably still lack a lot of these communicative skills. And now the workplace is the burdens on them to teach them how to effectively communicate. And this all comes back to what you said earlier, meeting people where they're at with the right different learning styles and leaning into that by giving the right tools, training, and resources to lay those foundations.
And we can blame our parents for not teaching us to be effective communicators, because chances are most of us come from broken homes. Most of us come from very toxic personalities and that, or dealing with that. We can use that as an excuse all day, but eventually you have to realize you're a freaking adult. You have your own agency, you have your own choices, and you can continue to enable to that, or you can learn the skill set and better yourself, right? You can learn even at a basic level and that what people are asking, and that, because I can't tell you how many people I'll talk to that they don't understand that when a complaint is brought up on that, or somebody's like, for example, when I would get somebody that would come after me and get I would take maybe 2 hours to respond to something basic, right? And they blow up at me and say like, this is ridiculous and this is unacceptable, blah, blah, blah. Well, I realize that that's not necessarily a rational reaction based on that, right?
Right. What's your service level agreement, right? When are you just standard communicating back to customers within 24 hours? Maybe it's 2 hours, maybe it's 1 hour, like whatever that service level agreement. And then for them to assume that you didn't do it fast enough when they have no control or insight into what your world looks like.
Well, I had a customer that was literally paying $200 a month, and they expected us to be able to answer the call within 5 minutes and fix the issue. I'm like, you're not paying us to be on call.
Right.
Like, otherwise you're paying for a full-time employee to be dedicated to you and that to do that.
Which is, if that's a conversation they want to have, you could easily have that conversation, right?
Exactly. But that's where communicating that expectation up front. And this is also where, as parents and as other people, it is our job to take the initial responsibility is always on us, and take full accountability for whoever we come in the conversation with. It's the same reason that you'll see me always go to somebody and even if they're being a confrontational, I'll always assume that just either they're having a bad day or they're not an effective communicator or whatever else, and I will try to find that common ground and that with them to be able to move forward on a positive note and be able to transition that. Because just how you approach the situation, it goes back to even our earlier conversation with when we went to the Arate, the mindset you go into things greatly determines and changes the outcome and that you will receive, right?
Yeah.
And that's where I think it's so paramount, and that to even with kids, like teaching them early in that, hey, say what you do what you say, and then go through and move forward on every single foundational key principle, and that to do that. Honestly, just with basic things on that is a great way to build communication. And a lot of it, again, is nonverbal. Like most communication is nonverbal. Obviously, with text or email, it's very different also to understand tones. And I've even caught myself a few times in that, where somebody will be abrupt or brief with their email, and I'll think that they're just being a confrontational asshole.
Sure.
But the reality is that they're just brief, and they were short, and they were rushed, and that they were stressed out. They could have had kids yelling in the background. And so, of course, they kind of transition some of that energy into that moment, right?
Yeah. It can come back to not what you say, but how you say it, right? Simon Sinek talks about people don't care what you do, they care why you do it. But you can't get to that point where they're going to care why you do it if they don't understand how much you actually care about what they're up to. And so, yeah, just so many different ways. But it's a daily lesson in our household as well. And the work I do, not what you say, but how you say it. And it can go either way. You know, you can it could easily go either way.
Absolutely. Well, and I think that's, again, so in summary, if you guys are still listening to this, the biggest key takeaway that you really should have is, again, communication is founded on trust, and also the ability for understanding. So if you don't create that culture, if you don't create that in both your home and your business and your work life with your coworkers, if you aren't somebody that people know that they can rely on, if they're not somebody that knows that they're going to say what they do and do what they say, then you've shut down, you yourself have shut down the ability for communication. So it is an individual responsibility for communication to be effective and to actually be able to set up that.
100%.
It is, as a leader, though, it is also it's just the same thing, that mold will grow in a damp environment. So it's your job to get rid of the possibility and that for mold to grow in the first place by controlling the other factors you can, and at enabling growth. Because it's a fine line between too much humidity and causing mold issues and other unhealthy things, versus a controlled environment that allows fruits and vegetables and everything else to grow. If hopefully that metaphor makes sense.
Absolutely.
But the more you, that is, as a leader, and that is helping that environment. Mold and fungus and that will still grow even in a normal greenhouse at normal levels and that. But if you put in the correct measures, the correct nutrients, the correct other things, it avoids that, and then allows the best results for your staff and employees to grow it and bloom into fruition, and to also get a better crop at the end of the day, which is more money in your employees' pockets, more money in the company's pockets, and just more success and happiness in general.
Yep, for you and your customers. Your
Absolutely. Team. Well, I mean, success is through servitude, right? And how well can we communicate to our customer? That's sales even.
Yeah, absolutely.
How well are we good at communicating how our product is going to solve their pain?
Exactly. So, man, there's so many different avenues that we could go with this. My mind's just racing, but yeah, no, it's been a great conversation.
At lunch. So, well, thanks, Danny, for joining us here. You enjoy lunch with your kids and that. Congratulate him, by the way, because he just had his son come back from it's a church mission, and he's been gone. Was it 18 months and then, or
2 years, solid 2 years? Yeah.
2 years?
So yeah, all voluntary and everything. So pretty remarkable. And yeah, we're.
I don't know how long. I know that sometimes was an MTC. They'll usually have that count as the first 3 months and that, but I know they shortened that.
Yeah. His was not very long there. Yeah, a couple of weeks or so, and then 2 years in Washington Tacoma mission and stuff, and yeah, just serving people and learning how to grow up and better communicate and things like that. And I mean, 9-day difference.
Even if you don't believe in that stuff,
so it's an experience, right?
It's life experience. It's just so much a responsibility, because I know for a fact you've seen your son grow up massively and change as a
Absolutely.
person.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah, I
and
recommend anything to anybody to get out there to serve, get outside of yourself and serve your community, others around you, anything like that. I mean, it'll just teach you life lessons in ways that hanging out with your
how much
college
do you
roommates will
think?
never do.
Well, how much do you think that that's helped him with communication and an ability to understand people from different backgrounds and cultures just
Oh,
from that little experience? Even though it's still in the States, right? It's just
exactly.
Washington, but it's still a drastically different culture.
Yeah, completely, completely. And it's changed him, changed him for the better, to have a better perspective and appreciation of others, outside of his beliefs and what his knowledge is and things there too. So it's just been phenomenal. So yeah, so grateful for that. So thanks so much for taking some time today, Cameron, too. Appreciate it.
Not a problem. And again, thank you guys for joining us. Thank you for listening. Remember to like, share this podcast, and that's the only way we can really add value or help other people and be able to make this world a better place. Remember, independently, we're strong, but together we're unstoppable. So join us next time where we talk more on how to be the best employer and employee and thrive within our own environments. Stay blessed and have a great day.
All right. Thanks.